is Doug Edmonds. I'm the current president of ASIST, and this is Trey Orfanides, our vice president, and Dan Lucas down here in front is our webmaster. We're actually currently in search of a treasurer, so if anyone is interested, treasurer/secretary. In any case, this is the first of our spring panel discussion events. We're going to have two more coming up, one next Monday, and then one on the following Monday, April 9th, and it's all out there on the ASIST webpage. If you just go to ils.unc.edu/ASIST, you'll find more information about those events. But we do appreciate you coming today. Today's topic, this conversation is being blogged, our lives online all the time, in the trend towards life blogging. And we're fortunate enough to have our friend and professor colleague, I guess I should say, Dr. Deborah Burrow here with us today to lead, and several distinguished panelists. So I'll let them introduce themselves as we go through. I know they got uncomfortable when I called them distinguished, but you look pretty distinguished. So.
They can decide if they
Yeah, exactly. But I'm not going to make all introductions. And you have the capsule sort of description of why you're here, so I'm not going to reread what we had posted. But that's our topic today. We're going to probably go through and have Dr. Burrow frame the conversation, and we'll have some chance for the panelists to respond, and then we'll kind of open it up to questions if that sounds good. But it's a very flexible format, so feel free to jump in when you want to, I guess. Thanks.
We've also asked that everybody's initial comments be brief, so that there will be time for a conversation, and I have a class at 2 o'clock. First of all, the first blog or weblog that I saw was one that I encountered accidentally a couple of years ago. It was a site retrieved in a Google search on some topic of interest that I was researching for one of my classes. I confess that it shocked me a little. The first encounter was a personal diary, a woman, young I assume, pouring her heart out on a topic for others to read and comment upon. I've read other diaries before, Anne Frank's comes to mind, but usually published long after the person's death, when neither author nor reader need feel embarrassed by such intimacy. Why do we record our thoughts, take photographs and videos of events in our lives, keep notes from meetings, record messages, and save mementos? There are many reasons, but one we hear often is to preserve a memory, to give us the opportunity to look back on these times and recall these experiences, or the feelings that we had. We might show these treasures to friends or family, particularly those who may have shared the initial experiences with us. But the memories are our own, and the value is personal. But not always. While many early chronicles, diaries, and journals were never intended for public consumption, others were written specifically for that purpose. Mark Twain, for example, frequently reflected publicly on the times in which he lived, and in his travels around the world, he reported on his experiences with humor as he encountered new people and places. Indeed, he often traveled as a paid newspaper correspondent, and his musings entertained many. These public journals were more carefully edited, written by professionals or field experts who were aware of their audiences. According to Goffman and others who study social behavior, each person attempts to guide and control the impressions that others have of him. Awareness of an audience will therefore influence what we say and how we say it. The web offers everyone, or anyone, with a computer and an information service provider the opportunity to share her thoughts and ideas with the world. Cheap storage, fast processing, and standardized formats make it feasible to maintain a record of our lives and put it out there, with or without commentary, for public consumption. Like-minded individuals with similar interests or in need of conversation can find an audience regardless of their credentials. And why not? After all, truth is stranger than fiction, and the lives of real people are far more interesting than anything we can imagine. Although commentaries, as well as the quality of audio, images, and video produced by most of us may be raw, they seem fresh and sincere when compared with Madison Avenue polished promotional pieces and organizationally vetted tracks whose messages are watered down and all too familiar. Technology offers the opportunity to go beyond writing about our experiences to recording them. Gordon Bell and others at Microsoft Research are exploring car-based systems CARP is an acronym for Continuous Archival Recording of Personal Experience. These systems can capture human experiences through audio, photographic images, and video, and provide rudimentary tools for managing the data. Wearing a camera and recording device about the size of a cigarette package and weighing only a few ounces, we can make human interaction a matter of personal record. Scott Carlson, in a recent issue of the Chronicle of Higher Education, quotes researchers who predict that we will all be wearing such devices in a few years. But Carlson spoke of feeling great relief when, for a weekend, he turned off the recording device he had been wearing constantly and could just be. How many of you have seen Justin TV? www.justintv? He's been live for 10 days now, and he's wearing a video camera. So you can log onto the web, and you can see what he's seeing, and if you register at the site, you can comment on what he's seeing and see what other people are commenting. You can interact with it. So it's just another example of this kind of technology. CARP systems introduce problems with respect to preservation and privacy, which others on this panel will address. Beyond this, from a personal information management perspective, I wonder how we will use this data. While I cannot imagine sitting down to relive an entire year of my life, I suppose I can, in a narcissistic moment, imagine replaying those few minutes of a given year when I accepted a teaching award. Data from CARP systems offer opportunities to relive events and learn from experience, something that might be particularly useful in educational contexts when we need to revisit a laboratory experiment, for example, to figure out what went wrong. On the downside, I fear that with CARP systems we are creating Big Brother, but from the ground up. I fear that the future may make suspects of those who are not featured in my space, not able to produce a record of their whereabouts on any given day and time, not posting thoughts to their blogs or appearing in the recorded lives of their friends. Further, it may be more difficult to forgive the folly of youth when we witness events from 20 or 30 years into the future, removed from the pressures of the time and absent the hormones. I see benefits to these systems, but for limited time frames and controlled settings. I think we're better off living our lives rather than recording them. After all, we forgive ourselves for forgetting what really happened at some unhappy time in our past. But we hold suspect, and most of you are too young to remember this, we hold suspect even an 18.5-minute gap on the recorded tape.
Whichever you prefer. Oh, should I just sit down?
No, you
We're going to just hear you do that. You can stand there for my places.
I'm sorry, I have no explanation for the 18.5 minutes. Our Lookout 3 has a really good one. Okay, so I'm going to throw out a question to you, and then I'll give you a few kind of half-baked provisional answers from my point of view. But I'm sorry. I'm Cal Lee, and I'm on the faculty at the School of Information and Library Science. So my question for you is, of these technologies you're familiar with, blogs, YouTube, all these things often called social software, right, sort of ways that people can freely exchange information. If you put yourself in the year 2107, what would we need as documentation of life as lived through these technologies? What sorts of things would we actually want to have at our disposal? And then, of course, the associated questions are what to keep and who should be responsible for keeping those things. And if you have good answers to those and they're not doing it now, what are the things potentially keeping them from keeping those things now? So I just wanted to point out briefly that a great deal of collecting activity of documentary materials has been informal and non-institutional, right? What we consider now to be formal journals were an outgrowth from in the 17th century of correspondence that, even though they were among a fairly elite group, were quite informal in communicating with each other. Cabinets of curiosities and these various things that emerged to be curated collections originally were more identity formation than anything else, right? They were people putting together materials that they thought said something about them, right? Perhaps that kind of harkens to a lot of what's going on right now in these spaces. And so I would contend there are basically two types of decisions to be made here in terms of what to keep, right? And one is perspective, what to actually capture, right? If you actually get into the world of wearing one of these little cameras, or you even document a family trip taking digital photographs, you're making decisions about what from the stream of experience you want to capture for some particular reason, right? And then the next question is retrospective, which is, what do I keep, right? I've captured a bunch of this stuff. Do I keep temp files on my computer? Do I flush the cache on my browser, right? What are the things I actually keep around, and what are the things that I get rid of? So the question then is, how should information professionals potentially intervene here, right? When we talk about information professionals, which is what we at SILS are in the business of trying to train, I think it's very important to recognize that word professional, right? We all create and manage collections of information. How should professionals actually engage in these kinds of environments? And I think it's really important to recognize what the values might be, right? So perhaps there are things that we want to capture from other people's collections that speak to issues of accountability. I actually want to be sure that 5 or 10 years from now, people will know what you actually posted to your website. People will actually know that you attended a public meeting. Aspects of evidence, right? Can we keep things in a way that actually allows us to prove facts about what happened in the past and provide evidence of those, not just sort of disembodied, disentangled streams of information? The context, right? What sort of information has to be available about these various materials that might help us to make sense of them? And then diversity of lives and perspectives, right? One thing that Deborah was talking about is this idea in her written comments. I don't recall if you talked about this, but I know it was in her original written comments of, will we in the future be biased against those who didn't capture their lives in these ways, right? If I go to something from Flickr, assuming that all the intellectual property issues have actually been resolved, and I go in there and I see photographs from the year 2007, am I then assuming somewhat very misrepresentative things about the past because that's all that got captured, right? And I basically just want to throw those questions out to you. The format here is really for us to throw out a few comments and then have a very engaged discussion, hopefully. But I think revisiting that question of what in 100 years do we think really needs to be documented about these things, recognizing that from the point of view of archivists and special collections people, it's usually been somewhere on the order of about 5% of the documentary material out there, right? Most stuff we know is not going to be retained for the long term. But what sorts of values do we need to uphold to start thinking about what we want to retain, what we very purposely want to not retain, right? We're not all wanting to be held accountable for every activity we ever engage in, right? So I'll just leave you with that.
There's a microphone.
Did you say that? Yeah, I'm going to pass the hands on.
Just for the say that.
Thank you. How close can I hold this to myself before I blast you out of your seats? Okay, there we go.
We can't hear what you're doing.
All right. Hi, I'm Jeff Pomerantz, and I'm also a faculty member at SILS. I am not going to talk about anything professional, but rather personal, more or less personal. I have 2 blogs, actually, neither of which I keep very regularly. But one is my own personal blog, and one is my daughter's blog. I'll get to that in a moment. I want to take off on one specific thing that Deborah said, which is the notion of ubiquitous capture of more or less everything all the time. That she can't imagine reliving an entire year, but could imagine reliving a particular moment in time. My personal take on that is, are you really that interesting? Why on earth would you want to capture everything all the time? But I agree completely that capturing particular moments is valuable, and it's what we do already to a certain extent, as Cal pointed out. And this gets me to my daughter's blog. Well, I think so, obviously, but
You should let them know about how big your daughter is.
she's. You can go to her blog, but she is about 11 months old, and one of the first things that I did after she was born was set up a photo blog for her. I mean, I remember sitting with my wife, setting up on the spot. She was maybe several hours old. It was absolutely things I did. Thank you very much. And the purpose of doing that was it seemed easier than emailing photos every day or so, right at first, to all of our relatives. And I just sent out a URL and said, go check it periodically, and I've maintained it over the past 11 months. And it's been the way that we keep our families, primarily, up to date on Charlotte's development. Her name is Charlotte. It is, I'll give you a moment to think about this for a second, Charlotte's weblog, yes. So what I want to talk about is blogging by proxy, right? I have my own personal blog, and that doesn't have very much personal stuff on it. It's mostly professional musings and news items and whatnot. But Charlotte's blog is entirely personal. I'm writing about her development, what cute thing she did today, and photos and video, which is frankly quite a lot of information about this child who is not old enough to object. Right?
That'll come soon.
Yeah. Oh, God knows, yes. But for a long time, I had Charlotte's blog on the open web, and I recently password protected it, in part to cut down on comment spam, which worked reasonably well, and in part because after a while, thinking about it, I got to the point where I was simply not comfortable with Charlotte growing up in public like that. However, there's a good 6 months of her growing up in public out there, probably cached in Google or God knows where, somewhere. So my question to myself is, what are my ethical responsibilities towards Charlotte in keeping this blog? And my first step moving in that direction was to password protect the blog. And, yes, as Cal points out, she'll be old enough to object soon enough. I have absolutely no doubt that she will be horribly embarrassed by this blog when she's old enough to be embarrassed by her parents, the way we're all embarrassed when our parents whip out their photo album and to show to our spouses or significant others or whatnot. I mean, I'm sure that will come. But I'm talking about more than that. This is more extreme than preserving photos for the sake of maintaining memory. This is a very microscopic view of the development of a child who is not old enough to consent to having it done. So if this is a concern for maintaining one's own blog and one's own materials, surely it's even a concern when you're doing this on behalf of another person. And I would submit, controversial statement here, that it was actually irresponsible of me to have this blog ever on the open web. I should never have done it. It should have been password protected from day one. And baby blogs that are on the open web are frankly irresponsible because anybody can gain access to them. You don't know who your viewers are. There's not sufficient protection online for children, SIPA notwithstanding. The Children's Internet Protection Act, is that what it stands for? Right, there are a different set of laws for how corporations specifically can interact with minors online. I, of course, am the adult who would be doing the consenting for Charlotte, but nevertheless, ignoring all SIPA regulations, I put all this material online, and it's actually slightly embarrassing to me. But I would submit that it was actively irresponsible of me to do that in public for as long as I did.
To your credit, you were very sleep deprived.
Well, yes. It seemed like a good idea. But anyway, that is my controversial statement in conclusion, that it is an irresponsible thing to do.
I'm Paul Jones. I'm delighted to be here. Part of me is a journalist. I'm perfectly happy writing about stuff. People who read my blog know that I've already posted the statements I posted them last night that I'm going to talk about. And a couple of you commented already or sent me email about them, which is very nice. And I'm going to approach this differently than these guys because why not, right? So actually I want to put some other context and some further readings behind it. So Deborah alluded to 1984, so I thought I would start with 1984. the great thing about 1984 is it's all about information science and about recording and about technology and about interactions with information and collection of information. Winston Smith, the protagonist, the last man in England, with the original title of the book, lives in a surveillance society where cameras, your television, your neighbors are all aware of your every move, your every action. Not everybody, by the way, but only the significant people in the inner and outer parties. The plebes are free to do whatever they want, because really they don't matter all that much. But he himself, Winston's job, is the manipulation and the changing of memory. He works to change history as history needs to be changed by the inner party. And he drops what is not essential into the memory hole to make it all disappear. But perhaps the greatest irony of the book is due to an architectural malfunction in Winston's apartment. There is one place where he is not observed in his entire life. And in that one place, he performs an act. He keeps a journal. And in that journal, he commits thought crime. So in a world of recording, the one place he can go where he's not recorded, what does he do? Record. With that in mind, I'd like us to look at what's happened in the last century in America. We've gone from a society in which we were well known to a society in which we were very private. We were private by means of anonymity, by means of urbanization, and we've had a degree of privacy, anonymity, and change unknown in human history. Stephen Knock talks about this extensively in his book, The Cost of Privacy, Surveillance and Reputation in America, which I recommend, and the link to the book, of course, is on my website, on the blog, as is the link to 1984. Knock claims, and I'd say validly, that past generations experienced privacy in ways that have never been available to young people in the history of America. Mostly in 1907, people stayed at home. They lived with their families until they were married. Sometimes after that, they worked with their families or in their circumscribed small town. They were known deeply by everyone around. In the past century, this changed radically. Instead, this deep knowledge, this reputation and trust was replaced by three means. One we've already talked about, surveillance, which we've seen increased. That's because we're living in a nation of strangers. We work not with people that we've known for years, unless you're in the School of Information Library Science. Generally, people keep jobs about 5 years. But in terms of months, we're served by people we know sporadically. We give them our credit cards, probably drug-using, late-night staying restaurant food service workers. We hire strangers to work for us. We do business with them. There's surveillance that replaces some of that knowledge, and the other parts that replace our knowledge and in which we place our trust, or what Knock would say are credentials, a driver's license, a diploma from the University of North Carolina, so a credit card, a credential that replaces that deep knowledge, that shows that you've been through what he says is an ordeal. On one day, you drove well for a few hours. Now you have a certificate. A credential that says you will continue to drive well. This is you have a credit card that represents that you will be able eventually to pay. You've been through an ordeal, a credit check. You have a diploma from the University of North Carolina that shows you were exposed to knowledge and been through certain ordeals which we have performed on you. But this is changing now completely radically as people are living in the open, sharing more information, and are available. So what will this do to change now that we live more in the open? What is not talks about the cost of privacy, that replacement of deep knowledge, reputation, and trust with certificates, ordeals, and surveillance. What are the costs of openness? I think that's one of the things that our previous speakers were trying to allude to. And what are the costs there, perhaps, of vanity of that openness? A little Ecclesiastes. Now, the third thing I'd like to allude to is another change in personal perception that I would like to know more about, that I think will give us clues into what we're doing now. So, as you probably know, before the middle 19th century, and really before the beginning of the 20th century, no one knew what their ancestors looked like except rich people. In fact, nobody knew what they looked like a year ago or as a child. It's because there's no really good way of knowing what you looked like until George Eastman saved us all and let us know about this. Rich people knew about themselves, they knew about their families, but most of us did not. But the cameras had profound cultural effects. We all now can keep our memories. We all now, even if illiterate, can save our pictures of ourselves and our histories in deep ways and across all cultures. People are now, what happens now? How does that affect how our culture works, how we know about ourselves, how we think about what's worth saving, and how we invoke memory? So this is one of the places where I hope you guys will send me pointers to some good things to read. And I thought about this when I realized, of course, we were going to speak here in this room, in which we're surrounded by our cultural memories, our ways of seeing into a past that we could not have done before Eastman, and that we wouldn't have available in a personal way. Last night, when I told my wife we were going to do this, she said, "Oh, you're going to talk about Susan Sontag, home photography." And I went, "Actually, no. Because I'm interested not in how the photographer performs an act, transgressive, active, or passive, but how individuals themselves, empowered by the technology to record the most banal, the things that would never be evaluated by callous save, but are the most essential. The daily life that will rarely be seen as what we need, but might be, there's so much of this out there, why bother to save it? Those kind of things that have direct cultural impact on our self-perceptions, our histories, our social interactions, and the ways in which we evaluate each other. So I'm really interested in a book that I've been picking at that I haven't gotten in the art library called Photography of Cultural History. And if you guys can recommend anything else that operates in that area, I'd really, really like to know about it, because I think that the part of the clue to how we re-represent, how we think about ourselves as a culture, how our personal actions work, can actually track in some ways the rise and what we're looking at now, perhaps the fall of photography.
Mr. Aksha, and I'm a doctoral student in sales. So about 3 summers back, I heard Gordon Bell, which Deborah mentioned from Microsoft, talking about this My Life Bit software from Microsoft, which allows you to capture everything, well, sort of everything in your life. You have this camera, you have, you photocopy all your things, you digitize all your, papers and everything. So apparently, Gordon Bell is now paperless. He has everything digitized. His life is digitized. He had lots of pictures and everything. I heard this talk. It was actually one of those talks in a big IR conference. And I kept asking myself, so what? understand. I didn't quite get the idea of, why would somebody do this? I mean, somebody recording my entire life. Who's going to watch it? Who's going to, including me? And as Jeff pointed out, are you that interesting?
Yes.
But
I would submit that none of us are.
so if
But collectively, we represent daily life.
that's why they're recording us together and this event.
Is that thing on?
But so the same summer, I was doing a road trip from California to Massachusetts, and this idea was still in my head. I was like, well, actually, it's kind of cool. I still don't understand why somebody would do it, but it's kind of a cool idea to record. So this is what I did. I was driving along. I put this little webcam on my dashboard, looking at the road, and as I was driving, I had the laptop connected with it, and I recorded the whole video of a road trip, but not the continuous video in time-lapse manner. So it's all going really fast, forward manner. Now, it's pretty interesting, actually, if you look at the video. I mean, if you look at the real video, it's going to be boring because it's, you just look at the road, you're driving. Certain parts are interesting, but this isn't, in fast-forward motion. And it was pretty cool, and I thought, wow, I mean, I preserved my entire road trip in this. And I showed to all my friends, and they were really impressed. But later I thought about it, that I never looked at this thing by myself. I always looked at it when I was showing it to somebody. So it wasn't so much about the preservation of it, but it was more kind of like showcasing of it. I've actually driven through those roads. I've seen what this video is recorded. I've seen it through my eyes, and I've experienced those things. And that was way more interesting than looking at these videos. Of course, people who haven't been on that, they see this thing, oh wow, this is so interesting, this is a cool idea, you record this thing, great. So my question is, as Cal was pointing out, you do this for preservation, you want to preserve your memories and stuff, but a lot of times, if you pay attention to all the social networks and a lot of other things where we are recording things, we're not actually doing so much for ourselves, but for other people to know. So in other words, we want people to be witness of our life. When Pluto was a planet, we used to use our spouses and family and friends for this. I hope we keep doing that even now, but people have started, for example, if you look at the Facebook, there is this little field there which allows you to record your status. But you can say, I'm in my office, I'm at home and stuff. But if you look at anyone's Facebook, people hardly say that. People say all kind of weird stuff, I'm feeling sad. I'm really excited about this weekend, and so on. This is not about that. This is not, he's doing this not for himself or herself. They're doing it for other people to know. Yeah. So it's really important to understand why we are logging these activities or events, pictures or whatever. Is it really for the memories or preservation? Or is it showcasing to our friends and the world? And that's where the main difference between your traditional journal and the blog comes in, because traditionally the journals were a personal diary, were a personal thing. It was meant to be for your own reading and writing, and you would usually not like other people to read. Whereas now, blog, I mean, of course there are private blogs and password protected blogs and all kinds of things, but by default, if you just go somewhere, open a blog, it's open to everyone. Okay? And in a way, that's what people want. So I think it's really important that we understand why we are recording these things and where we are going with it. And with this, I'll leave it to.
Paul's sharing his status personally. His online status.
My online status is accurate.
He's on the stage.
It's not.
I'm Terrell Russell. I'm also a PhD student here. This is year 3, I think. Is that right? I think my advisor is on this up here with me. So Chirag, actually we said in exactly the right order somehow. Maybe he read that I wrote this last night and cheated and sat there on purpose. But I'm most interested in audience at this point regarding this life logging issue. And so, like Paul, cheated and wrote this stuff down ahead of time. We'll argue later about how his presentation was better than mine. So my provocative issue revolves around the idea of what's personal and what's global. This publishing is so easy now. We find it very easy to connect with people who are interested in what we're doing. If you write a professional type of a blog or you keep notes online, people who are interested in the same topics will be using the same words, will be using the same phrases. They will find you. And I've found it remarkable. I've been kind of living this in public now for about a year, I guess, and maybe a little bit more than that. And I get email from people I've never heard of, never read, never met, asking insightful questions. They've obviously done their own homework, or they're obviously in this industry or interested in what I'm doing. And it allows me to have conversations I never would have had before. Of course, the downside of this is there's always people that are reading me that maybe I don't know. It's an invisible audience. So these search engines will pick up all this stuff, whether it comes from a little cigarette pack that you're rebroadcasting out, or you're Justin and you have your own TV website, or you're having a blog for your daughter, right? It's all the same thing in the eyes of the search engines. They don't make any qualitative assessment as to what it's picking up. It just records it all, like Paul. But online, what I want to say is that our identity, who we are, consolidates to what is findable about you. If you are not findable online, I think in the short term, in the future, you will be much less relevant when things that are interesting to you come up. People will not be able to find you. They will not be able to come to you for advice, come to you for expertise. And the interesting thing about this is that when it does consolidate, all these different personas that you may have in the real world, when you have different audiences, you can be one person with your friends, one person with your family, one with your professional colleagues. You can go to Las Vegas, you can have a weekend, whatever. But you've got different contexts with those different parties, and when push comes to shove, we're really only one person. If somebody gets to know you well enough along any of those contexts, they get you. They become one of your people. They understand who you are, what you're about. Obviously, there's a gradient there, and you let people in as much as you want to. But when we navigate this in the physical world, we understand how this works. We've spent a lot of time being social. We deal with humans constantly. And we have a pretty good understanding of how information leaks from person to person. You know who you can trust. You know you can tell your secrets to. You know what level of secrets you can tell to different people, and how quickly they come back to you from some other source. Online, this is a lot different. Online, it's an invisible audience, and largely it's global. You pretty much have to be speaking to everyone, or at least expecting you're speaking to everyone every time you write something online. And I think that's a fundamental shift that we've not really gotten our heads around yet. So the question then is, when everything is recorded, who's the audience? Is it yourself? Is it your children, your friends, your boss, your next boss? They're all different. And who should your audience be? Can we reasonably believe we can have more than one, that we can separate them one from another? What is going to be said about us 25 years from now? Is what you're saying right now going to hold up? Are you going to be embarrassed? If so, don't write it. It'll be there. It'll be waiting for you. You'll have to deal with it. So what I'm concerned about, the privacy implications of all this self-recording, I'm more fascinated with the perceptions of those broadcasting themselves about their own projection, their own sense of what the world sees in them. And I'd like to hear some questions about that if that's interesting. And I think I now pass it back to Deborah, and she will take questions. Is that how this works?
We'd like to invite your questions and comments. Something to add. Back in the back.
Well, I'm interested in lots of different aspects of what you said. The last thought, based on what you said, is the sort of question of whether or not there's a sense that you have your blog self and your real self, and how much schizophrenic identity people have, or double identity or mask identity. Maybe your blog self is really your mask and not your real self. But I guess I'll start with this question because I just heard this morning about the problem with digital preserving or digital art, how that is to be preserved, and the development of this score, which they were saying the novel thing about this is that for the first time you have a means of letting the artist tell the archivist or the museum curator what is important about what is essential to preserve, given the fact that formats are going to change. So what is essential to preserve to this digital art being presented in a future realm? And so I guess I was, and then my other comment is my frustration with the whole blog, primacy of blog culture, is that as a person who does journal, I just want a software product that allows me to organize my journals that is for me, helping me to have a journal that I can easily access different aspects of it. Like when I journal, if it's a writing idea, I put a big W, and then I have to go back and look. But I just like to be able to sort. And someone told me, oh, that technology is about 10 years away. And I wonder, is it really 10 years away? And it sounds unreasonable that you can't be private. You can't take advantage of some of this technology in a private way.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Password protect your blog.
Yeah, it's very easy.
Well, no, I don't want anything online. I just want it from you.
You can write it on your machine. You can write it on there's plenty out there. I mean, there's no reason. You can restrict access in many different ways, as my 14-year-old has shown me. Every time I find out something about it.
The digital art about the preservation.
Sure.
Yeah, preservation.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of the variable media initiative and these things about art and kind of, asking artists what are the significant properties that should be retained. I think one thing in a lot of these environments that's important to recognize is that we're progressively getting good at preserving objects that are digital, a file, or, let's make it PDF-A rather than PDF, and it'll be easier to preserve. We're profoundly bad at maintaining the links that are actually the valuable thing in a lot of these environments, right? We think in terms of things and not the relations between things. And if you try to, that's one of the things behind my question about context, about things that we value. If we get a bunch of disembodied little, hey, this was posted on YouTube. Well, can you show me where it was in YouTube? Nope, I've got the video, right? We might actually lose a great deal of the actual social meaning associated with these things, I think. And along the lines of this sort of private-public, I think along the lines of what Tara was saying, we're in this very unsure space right now about, there's been a lot of discussion in the archives literature for decades about this issue of how much recording is self-reflective, right? We'll just take the records from the person and we know they're kind of true in a certain way because you relied on the records, so you wouldn't have lied, right? Like I wouldn't cook the books because I have to rely on my own accounting to actually decide whether I have money left, right? And in this environment, I think it's very unsure because I think there are a lot of people who are not self-reflective about the fact that they're living in public. It just happens to be, as I've heard Paul point out in several forums, which I think is a really profound truth, which is with this software, it's easier to share than to not share. And so people just throw it out on their blog or they put something into Flickr, not because necessarily they want to consciously share it with 3 million people, because it's actually a whole lot more complicated to figure out how to set up passwords and send people links and stuff. You just put it into this public space and whoever wants to get to it can get to it, So I think we have a lot of very deep professional and ethical decisions to make about what self-reflection people had about what they were sharing, right? Were people just putting it out there because it was the easiest way? A peripheral issue is that almost all of these are not public spaces in a true sense. They're proprietary environments in which you're signing everything over to the company when you post something there. So I think there are a lot of issues about representation and preservation that really get down to what do we think people really are assuming about whether they're doing this in public. And I would contend probably a pretty large portion of people are not actually consciously. I mean, I've seen a lot of these blogs. You go through blogger.com where you can click see next blog, see next blog. Try to notice how many people are putting up pictures of their 8-year-old daughters and stuff. I don't think that people are doing that because they want the whole world to see them. I think they're doing it because they want people to see their blog and they're not really thinking about the fact that this is now out there for the world.
I'd add to that I think the question needs to be turned back on the blogger or fill in the blank recording device as to what your motivation is for doing this. I started my own personal blog, I don't know, 2 years back or something, because I was curious about the technology. And in thinking through on my blog, actually, why I was doing it, it struck me, and feel free to disagree with me on this, but it struck me that blogging is exhibitionistic, right? You do it because you want to submit to the world your thoughts, your observations, whatever. So why I'm keeping my daughter's blog is as a dissemination mechanism for news to a closed audience, now a closed audience, right? But blogging, personally, I think you need to think through why you're doing it. Are you seeking a sense of social connectedness with some very specific group or groups? Or is it exhibition,ism? And why do you read other people's blogs? Are you actually seeking news or some specific feed, to use sort of a generic term, or are you being a voyeur?
No. Let me.
That whole thing.
I have a couple of things to think about. So basically, I started my blog to keep records of things that I wanted to find later, and I didn't care if other people found them. A result from that is many of the things I posted, my memory or my questions or my notes actually got augmented by other people, and we actually had discussions. Lately I've been getting thank you notes because it turns out that aging PT Cruisers have a crank sensor that eventually gets covered with oil, and no Chrysler dealership can figure out that you can replace this $25 thing without doing doing about $3,000 worth of probing. But now people are searching, and I have the error codes. I have my entire history of the saga, which I really put down because I was thinking of suing Chrysler. and I thought, I better keep records. And I just started doing it, and people were searching, and people sent me fixes, and people sent me things that they tried. And we have this mini community of people doing this. Now people are writing me and saying, hey, my car was stalling. I bought this $25 thing. I installed it myself. I told the Chrysler guys, I'm out of here. And I get a little thank you note. I mean, it's fine. And it cost me nothing to share that. In fact, I gained that knowledge by living in the open. Now, I will say that while mine is not necessarily a vanity public performance, some of it is to let people know what's going on. It's not to the extent of, say, Byron, whose letters were carefully written with a public audience, who knew as he wrote his publisher and others whose letters the publisher was going to get. And when he really wanted to write a scathing letter, he sent a copy to his publisher because they would see it later. A master of doing this kind of work. Then briefly, so people do use this to frame themselves, to talk about themselves in a certain way, to create a persona. The way we live is, I'm not concerned about you have a block self, you have this self, you have this self, because we have multiple selves already. That's Sullivanian. Anybody who's been in psychology, you know this. When you do not know how to operate with your personality and context, you're not only socially but probably psychologically dysfunctional. And there are words for that, which I can't remember at the moment, but Sullivan's works are mostly deal with that. The last thing that I'd like to do just for fun is to think about how we know what we know about Greek statuary. How do you think we know about Greek statuary, particularly bronzes? Has anybody seen many Greek bronzes? There are hardly any extant. How do we know? We know because the Romans made marble copies. Most of our knowledge about Greek statuary comes from Roman marble copies of Greek bronzes.
So we need microfilm copies of blogs.
Marble copies.
Marble copies.
Carol, just to sort of follow up on what Cal said and what Jeff said, and Cal, you had said that people might not intend for their 8-year-old's picture to be out there now. If anybody wants to just search and Flickr on, kids in bathtubs, you see lots and lots of naked children, and you've got to select private or public. So I would assume, unfortunately, those people don't understand the magnitude. Now, going back with Jeff and cute little Charlotte, we're having this discussion about, appraisal and privacy and, public, etc. At what point would you let her participate in making a decision about her blog? At what level can we expect to, if we can't get our hands on these, how do we?
She started blogging when she's 6 years old.
When would you feel comfortable with her letting you help you appraise what she puts on there? Or
She has a global.
One of her favorite new toys is a keyboard. I mean, we had an old keyboard a computer keyboard, yes. Not a music keyboard, I'm sorry, yes.
Not one of those.
Well, obviously a computer keyboard, is there any other kind? No, I mean, we have an old crappy keyboard where some of the keys died, and it's her favorite new toy as of, about a week ago. I will let her write to her blog as soon as she's able to type, because it is password protected and because I more or less know who the audience is. I know who I've given the password to. I know who my parents and my wife's mother have likely given the password to. So it is as finite an audience for the blog as it's possible, I think, to get. So I'm comfortable with her writing on the blog as soon as she's able to write. But of course, I will explain to her that this is not something she's doing for herself or for mom and dad, that there is a wider audience out there. How that will be interpreted by a 3-year-old, or I don't know how old she'll be at that point. I won't know that until we get there, but I think it'll be kind of an interesting teachable moment, shall we say.
So you're still making the decision about the fact that it won't be global. A better question is, at what point will you allow her to flip that bit back?
Oh, at what point will I allow her to turn it into a public blog?
When she's 32.
When she's old enough to do it behind my back, there will be nothing I have to say. I mean, no, genuinely, I hand this one over to Paul, right? At what age is your child old enough to start doing things behind your back that you have no control over until you find out about them, if you find out about them?
Once they can crawl, I think it's pretty.
As soon as they can lift themselves out of bed and throw themselves out of the out of the crowd. I think it depends on your kid and what they do. It's just like how much you're going to bet what they read, how much you're going to bet what they do other things with. And different children will mature and show that at different ages. You'll feel that way and you'll set different things up for them. And one day you'll discover them on Facebook and you'll just casually say, well, I see you're in a relationship with blah, blah, blah. And then you'll go look again and there'll be privacy settings.
Yeah, almost there's two sides to this. I think there's the idea that capturing all the stuff that's happening publicly is actually, I mean, there's a massive amount of information, but it's public and it's available.
Right.
The other part of this is people start avoiding that by having conversations in other ways that aren't recordable. I mean, I know myself in my professional capacity have made phone calls instead of sending emails because I don't want a trail of the conversation I'm about to have. And I wonder.
I'm not allowed to discuss that.
But I got an account with the Public National Committee. I use their email now. But there is that going. You see that now. Exactly, not Gmail. You see that now. That you see, especially by people doing attempting to do end runs around systems, not realizing that it's still electronic and they're actually not running around it. But that's the other side of it. In some ways, I think we're almost driving some probably really valuable information underground into unrecordable ways because things are so recordable. And it's sort of this juxtaposition of like, you're almost going back to 1907 where you just tell your friends and the people on your farm because you just don't want the rest of the world to know about it. And I wonder where that spectrum swings and where we end up at some point. Where's that balance point between what's public and what's private, and the really essential stuff might need to be public and doesn't become public anymore because it's too easy and it's too accessible.
Sure, because you can't even assume that you're making a phone call that isn't on somebody's speakerphone.
Right.
So I think because we've been using phones so long that we're more comfortable with that, and we know the mechanism. It just,
Yeah, the reality is it's usually not being captured. It can be, but it's not usually.
But it is possible. But it's, whereas blog is.
But there are laws around that. Laws around capturing phone calls.
Yeah, but
there aren't laws around posting things on. There are, but there.
Well, so there are laws that are being ignored.
Right.
Phone conversations.
Well, so Shoshana Zuboff in her book In the Age of the Smart Machine, which is it's a bit of a dated book now, but I think one of the really profound concepts she has is informating. Right? And the idea is when your work or your activity, anything you do socially, is now symbolically encoded in order to happen. Right? If I call you over voice over IP or something, there's actually a bunch of symbolically represented stuff that can be captured somewhere that's being transferred, as opposed to a more kind of analog environment. And I think that's the difference, is that in general, right, the conventions for a phone conversation for various forms of activity are not encoded simply to happen, right? I mean, that's kind of the nature of records, right? They're evidence of something that just was left behind because you wanted to do something else. And so I think that that's increasingly, right, I mean, all these futuristic worlds where your refrigerator is ordering food for you and stuff, right? When all those things are happening, every single one of those is symbolically encoding something that could be retained and captured by somebody, right? And I think that that's something that, it changes things. And the information overload is so huge that most of it won't be retained. But there's always that kind of balance and risk associated with, maybe all of it is being retained, right? Every time I send something as packets through the internet, there are all these little places where it could be kept, right? And so I think that, email is an interesting case, right? Because so many people thought it was just a replacement for really informal phone conversations. So early on, like particularly sort of early 90s, people were doing all kinds of inappropriate things over email because they didn't have a sense that it was a record. I think that's changed now.
I missed that.
Yeah, most of my research is in Second Life, and I'm reading people like Edward Castronova, who call this your Earth avatar, because this is the avatar that you wear when you're in the Earth domain. And what I'm finding is that you have these environments, these virtual environments, where self is created very carefully with a great deal of attention paid to anonymity. And that then self becomes something that you use as almost a commodity to establish social closeness, if you wish. So in Second Life, you may be a vampire. You might establish a relationship with someone, and I find that people trickle in their Earth avatar reality into that relationship if they wish it to be something where they want more of their self to be known to that person. And so I think we have the situation in the future where people will be running avatars. It is common in Second Life for people to have multiple avatars, each one with a different sense of self that's been created. And I think it's becoming very strange and very interesting.
So let me speak to that a little bit, because there's early research on this already. You read Shirley Turkle's Life on Screen, I hope. Because Turkle talks about people running multiple textual avatars, even in furry bots and other places where you're allowed to be human, to transgress gender, to do all the kind of things you can do in Second Life with just a text. And people actually can and do work with these and work with them in multiple identities and do all this. And she has a pretty good set of studies on that would be really interesting to come back to in the Second Life environment, because there's not been a good follow-up to Life on Screen. And she does have some procedures that she talks about in that book, and some interview techniques that might really be useful, that you could build on that and see, has there been change, or has her stuff been predictive? I'd kind of like to see that myself.
I can ask a question myself.
in thinking about some of the privacy issues and whether or not people are very self-reflective in what they're doing, it strikes me, it reminds me of last fall when the whole Facebook not the wall posting thing, but remind me what the activity feed happened. And it blew up in their face because you think, here are all these college kids, at that time largely college students still, posting their activities. They don't care that everybody's seeing it because they're friending each other, blah, 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 and they're poking and this and that and the other. But then all of a sudden, when every last little detail of their activity online got pushed out without their approval, everybody freaked, and it kind of blew up on, on Facebook and the founders, and they had to post all the apologies, and they set up all the privacy settings, most of which I think a lot of people did end up taking advantage of. Now, I still, when I am combing through Facebook, I see a lot more information than I would be comfortable with if it were my 21-year-old daughter. But I think that sometimes we overestimate people's naivete about what they're revealing. And I can't imagine that the person putting their 8-year-old's picture online didn't think about it even for a second. I mean, if they're that naive in this day and age, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think and it may also be a generational issue, again, getting back to where maybe somebody under 25 is a lot more aware of some of these dynamics, and somebody who is in their mid-30s or older that wants to just post some family photos doesn't consider all the implications of it. Not to insult your intelligence.
Never blog anyone over 30.
Well, another thing is what moments you're living for, right? As you get older, you're more conscious of a longer span of time. If you're living in a social world in which sort of hooking up and getting to know people and cultivating your social network is mostly all that you care about, you might be conscious of those things, but they're not a top priority for you, right? So the priorities shift over time, and if all that stuff is retained for the next 20 years or something out to where suddenly, you no longer value the fact that you were doing these things to connect with your social world at the time. I think that those are the kind of things, I mean, there's no definitive answer to this. We have to work this out socially. But I think that it's a very ambiguous world we're in right now.
We're talking about the cost of privacy again. Yeah. Really, that privacy has a cost associated with it. That living in a world in which you're strange, or a stranger, has a cost. And openness also has a cost. So you're going to be negotiating those two costs and figuring out what you do. Previously, you had almost no option for privacy up to urbanization, basically. Up until 8 or 10 years ago, you lived in a very private world in which the cost of privacy you paid in surveillance and credentials and ordeals. And now you're in an area in which managing openness is a completely separate issue because you can. As you talked about, embedded in this is where your values of openness are. The importance of creating, maintaining, moving through social networks requires disclosure. There's no trust and no reputation retained. So, again, you're in this state in which I, for my part, try to talk about the cost of privacy, but ask about the price, the cost of openness.
I think we have to let Paul have the final last word. I promised an hour. Anybody who can hang around though and want to talk, at least some of the panelists will be able to stay. I do have to go to class. But thank all of you for coming, and thank you.